One of the nasty things about grief is that it just doesn't know when to stop, right? Grief doesn't have a firm expiration date that we can plan on, that we can schedule our lives around. Sometimes grief follows the stages of denial and of anger and of bargaining, depression, and acceptance. Sometimes it follows those orders nice and cleanly, but sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes grief lingers longer than we expected it to. And sometimes not only does it linger, but it grows. Like a long-distance Olympic runner, it continues to grow stronger with time as we grow weaker with time. Its stamina growing stronger as we feel like we can't keep up. We don't know how to catch up to our grief, and every well-meaning plan to remedy our situation just makes us feel worse, feel more grief. Because we've tried the plans and they haven't eased the depression. What makes us think this new plan will do anything different than every other plan that's been given to us before? We think something in us must be permanently broken, beyond the reach of any plan, we wrongly tell ourselves. What's the point? What's the point of entertaining yet another plan to quote-unquote fix us? What's the point of waking up tomorrow? Is life really worth all of this suffering? This is where our friend Job finds himself in Job chapter 3. After entering the dark cave of suffering in chapters 1 through 2, losing his health and his wealth and his family, it's like Job descends deeper into the cave of grief in chapter 3. His pain isn't letting up, it's actually getting stronger. And as Job considers his past and his present and his future, he comes to the conclusion that his life isn't worth continuing. His existence isn't worth having. It's a dark passage. For those of you who might identify with Job in this chapter, I know this is going to be a particularly hard passage for you this morning. You've been on my heart all week. We're going to be talking about some hard things. An existential curse and existential questions. But we're also going to look at what motivated Job's hopeless speech that Arius just read for us. And it's there in Job's motivation behind chapter 3 that I think we find a glimmer of hope, a glimmer of unfailing, inextinguishable hope. Before we can see that light, though, we need to see the darkness, which is where our passage starts, with an existential curse. In the first 10 verses of chapter 3, Job curses the day of his birth. The passage will be up on the screen, but it'd be helpful if you have your Bibles open so you can just follow along with me as I read. Starting in verse 1. After this, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. And Job said, "Let the day perish on which I was born, and the night that said, a man is conceived. Let that day be darkness. May God above not seek it, nor light shine upon it. Let gloom and deep darkness claim it. Let clouds dwell upon it. Let the blackness of the day terrify it, that night. Let thick darkness seize it. Let it not rejoice among the days of the year. Let it not come into the number of the months. Behold, let that night be barren. Let no joyful cry enter it. Let those curse it who curse the day, who are ready to rouse up Leviathan. Let the stars of its dawn be dark. Let it hope for light but have none, nor see the eyelids of the morning, because it did not shut the doors of my mother's womb, nor hide trouble from my eyes. This is disturbing. It's disturbing. A day that has just pulsed with hope and happiness for every culture throughout history, Job sees as hopeless and depressing. And not only hopeless and depressing, he thinks his birthday deserves to be cursed. This is not a light thing in the ancient Near East. No, this was a big deal. It's not a light thing like it is for us to curse something. In our culture, if you think of the word curse, you may think of R-rated language, right? Or perhaps road rage on the way to work. But Job in the ancient Near East is not just kind of flinging out empty R-rated language here. He's not muttering expletives under his breath on his way to work. No, Job is doing something far more profound. You see, if you were to curse something or someone in Job's day, it was like you were effectively damning that thing or that person when you cursed that thing or that person. Now, Job obviously can't force creation to undo his birth. He knows that. He knows that. But that's where his grief has brought him. And like some of you might relate to this morning, his grief feels too unusual for normal courses of action. And so he turns to unrealistic, unusual ideas. In verses 3 and 4, he wants God to rewind the clock and undo his birthday. To undo the day that Job was conceived, to uncreate or to decreate the light that God had created. In verses 4 through 6, Job breaks from the normal two-part poetic structure that would normally be used, and he uses an unusual three-part poetic structure to show just how overwhelming his grief is. And in verse 7, you can almost hear him screaming, "Behold, let that night of conception turn into a night of barrenness. Let no joyful cry enter it." Job's sanity is just unraveling throughout the passage. Verses 8 through 10, Job thinks if God and creation won't get the job done, if they won't listen to Job, well, then he's going to call upon someone else. He's going to call upon sorcerers to get the job done. In verses 8 through 10, he orders these hypothetical magicians to aggravate Leviathan. Leviathan was a mythical sea creature that was kind of seen as you could see it as the face of disorder, the captain of chaos in the ancient Near East. And Job wants Leviathan to bring his full array of chaos to the day of his conception and to destroy it. He wants Leviathan to blow out the stars like candles on a cake, snuffing out any light that would mark the existence of that 24-hour day. Why? Why did he want Leviathan to do this? Verse 10. Because that's the day responsible for not shielding Job's eyes from trouble. That's the day that made suffering possible. If only this curse could work, and that day be removed from the 365 calendar year, and that year would only turn into 364 days. If only the curse would work. But Job knows that's not possible. He's realistic. He understands that curse is not possible. And so in kind of despairing resignation, he's left with only existential why questions in verses 11 through 26. It's our second point, existential questions. In verses 11 through 19, Job asks the question, why did he have to live in the first place? Verse 11, why did I not die at birth, come out from the womb and expire? Why did the knees receive me, or why the breasts that I should nurse? For then I would have lain down and been quiet. I would have slept. Then I would have been at rest, with kings and counselors of the earth who rebuilt ruins for themselves, or with princes who had gold, who filled their houses with silver. Or why was I not as a hidden stillborn child, as infants who never see the light? There the wicked cease from troubling, and there the weary are at rest. There the prisoners are at ease together. They hear not the voice of the taskmaster. The small and the great are there, and the slave is free from his master. If Job hadn't had to live, he would have never known suffering. He'd have never known about the Sabaeans who stole Job's wealth and killed his children in chapter 1. He would have never known about the Chaldeans who murdered his children. And instead, they would have just all met in the grave. The king of the Chaldeans and the prince of the Sabaeans, they would have just met in the grave with the infant Job, who would have died at birth. They would have met in the grave where the prince of the Sabaeans and the king of the Chaldeans would be rendered powerless, and Job wouldn't have to be oppressed any longer. Why couldn't Job have just gone straight there on the day that he was born? He could have been freed from the haunting memories of the Sabaeans coming into the land. Or he'd have been freed from the haunting memories of the Chaldeans who killed his children. Memories that would have just played back over and over in his mind. He would have been free from all of that if he didn't have to live. Why did he have to live in the first place? And why does he have to keep living now? In verses 20 through 26, Job asks himself, why can't I die? Verse 20, why is light given to him who is in misery, and life to the bitter in soul, who long for death, but it comes not, and dig for it more than for hidden treasures, who rejoice exceedingly and are glad when they find the grave? Why is light given to a man whose way is hidden, whom God has hedged in? For my sighing comes instead of my bread, and my groanings are poured out like water. For the thing that I fear comes upon me, and what I dread befalls me. I am not at ease, nor am I quiet. I have no rest, but trouble comes. If cursing the day of his birth won't work, and if he can't undo the day of his conception, then Job wonders, why can't I just die? He digs for death like he's digging for gold. He covets the grave. Why won't God just let him go? Why does he hedge him in with suffering? Although he doesn't know it, Job uses the same language that Satan used back in chapter 1. Remember that? Chapter 1, Satan accuses God of building a hedge around Job that's keeping him from experiencing grief. But here in chapter 3, Job thinks God has constructed a different hedge around him. A hedge that's keeping Job from escaping his meaningless existence. In Job's mind, he's been transferred from the fortress of God over here to an insane asylum of grief over here. And God's keeping him there, and he can't get out. He's trapped in grief. Why? Why, Job wonders, why would God do that? God sees Job sighing. He sees his grief. He knows that Job isn't at ease or at rest. Why won't God just let Job die? Job's pain kind of sounds like a lament, doesn't it? Kind of like some of the laments that we've read from Psalms, like the one in Psalm 77 where the psalmist asks, "Has God forgotten to be gracious? Has he in anger shut up his compassion?" Job 3 kind of sounds like that. But unlike Psalm 77 and some of the other biblical laments in the Bible, you may have noticed that Job doesn't recount the promises of God in Job chapter 3. To use Mark Vergop's definition of lament again, like we used in the last Job sermon, his pain never turns to trust. Chapter 3 of Job is actually not even a prayer. Job's not really talking to anyone here in this chapter. He's not talking to his friends. He's not talking to God. While his friends and God were listening in to Job chapter 3, he's not really talking to them. He's kind of talking to himself, speaking this grief into the ether, which I think is very interesting. It's very interesting. I mean, it's incredibly sad, but I also think as we see this change in Job's audience and his tone, it's very interesting. Very interesting, because do you remember the last time that we heard from Job after he suffered? What were some of the things that he said? What was the tone of his speeches in chapters 1 and 2? Well, in chapter 1, verse 20, he started in the river of lament, tearing his robe and shaving his head. But where did he go? Where did that lament take him? Well, it took him to the ocean of praise, where he voiced his trust in the Lord. And he cried out, "The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And so I wonder, why don't we see a similar kind of verse in chapter 3? What happened? Well, why the change in tone? Where's the intimacy with God that we saw so clearly in the first 2 chapters? Where's the turn from pain to trust? Now, I don't think that we're given enough information in Job 3 and the rest of the book to say that Job is clearly sinning here. You may have noticed he never curses God in this chapter. He's cursing creation. But there is a change. There is a change in our friend Job. And I wonder why. In chapter 2, verse 13, while Job was on the ground in silent reflection with his friends for 7 days, I wonder what happened in Job's psyche as he's sitting there quietly, considering his life, his existence. What happened in Job's relationship with the Lord? What happened that precipitated the intense agony of chapter 3? What motivated Job's curse and Job's questions? It's our last point for the morning. What motivated Job's curse and Job's questions? Well, I think we get some help in chapter 10, actually. Chapter 10, it'll be on the screen. You're welcome to turn there if you'd like. But I think we get some help in chapter 10, verses 14 through 22. In chapter 10, verses 18 through 22, we see Job echoing some of the strange questions some of the same questions we see in chapter 3. He asks God in verse 18, "Why did you bring me out from the womb? Would that I had died before any eye had seen me, and were as though I had not been carried from the womb to the grave. Are not my days few? then cease, and leave me alone, that I may find a little cheer. Before I go, and I shall not return, to the land of darkness and deep shadow, the land of gloom like thick darkness, like deep shadow without any order, where light is as thick darkness. You see the similarities between chapter 10 and chapter 3? They're almost identical. Here's the big difference, though, between the two chapters. In Job 10, Job shares why he feels this way. That's the big difference. You skip back to verses 14 through 17, you'll see this. Starting in verse 14 of chapter 10, Job says, "If I sin, you watch me and do not acquit me of iniquity. If I am guilty, woe to me. If I am in the right, I cannot lift up my head. For I am filled with disgrace, and look on my affliction. And were my head lifted up, you would hunt me like a lion, and again work wonders against me. You renew your witnesses against me, and increase your vexation toward me. You bring fresh troops against me." When Job pictures God's posture toward him, he pictures a lion stalking him. That's how he pictures God. He pictures God as a military general ready to mow Job down in grief. He pictures God as being against him, not for him. He assumes God's frown towards him, not God's favor over him. And it's this perspective that leads him to believe that that's why he lost his health, wealth, and his family. It must have been that God was punishing him for some sin that he had done. That's what explains his grief in chapter 3. Job actually expresses this opinion over and over and over again throughout the book. So we're just going to walk through several of these verses. Chapter 6, verse 4, he says, "For the arrows of the Almighty are in me. My spirit drinks their poison. The terrors of God are arrayed against me." Chapter 7, verse 20, "Why have I become a burden to you?" Chapter 9, verses 16 through 18, Job says, "If I summoned him and he answered me, I would not believe that he was listening to my voice. For he crushes me with a tempest and multiplies my wounds without cause. He will not let me get my breath, but fills me with bitterness." Chapter 9, verse 34, "Let him take his rod away from me, and let not dread of him terrify me. Then I would speak without fear of him, for I am not so in myself." Chapter 10, verse 2, "I will say to God, do not condemn me. Let me know why you contend against me." Chapter 13, verse 24, Job continues. He asks, "Why do you hide your face and count me as your enemy?" Chapter 14, verse 13, "Oh, that you would hide me in Sheol, that you would conceal me until your wrath be past, that you would appoint me a set time and remember me." Chapter 16, verse 9, "God has torn me in his wrath and hated me. He has gnashed his teeth at me. My adversary sharpens his eyes against me." Chapter 19, verses 6 and 10 and 11 says, "Know then that God has put me in the wrong and closed his net about me. He breaks me down on every side, and I am gone. And my hope has he pulled up like a tree. He has kindled his wrath against me and counts me as his adversary." Chapter 23, verse 15, Therefore I am terrified at his presence. When I consider, I am in dread of him." And lastly, chapter 29, verse 2 through 5, Job says, "Oh, that I were as in the months of old, as in the days when God watched over me, when his lamp shone upon my head, and by his light I walked through darkness, as I was in my prime, when the friendship of God was upon my tent, when the Almighty was yet with me." No wonder Job cursed his birth. No wonder Job wanted to die. You see, more than losing his health and his wealth and his family, Job's worried that he's lost his friendship with God. And that was more than he could handle. It broke him. It broke him. The thought of God cursing him makes Job curse the day of his birth. The prospect that God would be angry at Job's life makes Job want to die. Life without God's favor is not worth the suffering for Job. But if only Job knew what God thought about him. If only Job actually knew what God thought about him. If he could have only heard God's commendation of him in chapter 1. Don't you just want to run to Job in chapter 3 and tell him what God said about him in chapter 1? In chapter 1, verse 8, when God told Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, that there is none like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil?" God wasn't against Job. God was for Job. God wasn't condemning Job. God was commending Job. Just want Job to know this. You want Job to know that God was for him, not against him. That he had God's favor, not God's frown. I mean, it wouldn't have kept back the tears, right? Or at least it shouldn't have. We talked about it last time. That it is totally right. It is totally biblical for Job to have grieved back in chapters 1 and 2. It was right for him to cry. We saw that Job lamented, he grieved, and he didn't sin. So Job did this. David did it. Jesus did it. It is totally right for him to grieve. But don't you think that chapter 3 would have looked a little different if Job knew that God was for him and not against him? I think so. I think Job 3 would have read a little different. I think Job would have brought his tears to God. He would have brought God his why questions instead of just silently reflecting or self-reflected in his why questions. He would have brought his why questions to the Lord. As he dug his heels into the favor of God, Job would have known that his life was not pointless, even though it felt pointless. Job could have trusted God for the timing of his death, even though he wanted to die sooner rather than later. Why? Why is that? Well, because he would have known that God wasn't punishing him, but praising him. Job would have known that God wasn't condemning him, but commending him. Because God was. He was doing all of that. In the backdrop of God having grief over Job's suffering, God the Father was so proud of his child, Job. He was so proud of him. Job just didn't see it. If only Job knew this is what God thought about him. If only we knew. If only we knew what God thought about us. As I've been in this text this week, that's been one of the burdens of my heart for you to know. If only we knew what God thought about us. If only you knew what God thought about you. It may not wipe away the tears. It may not lift the feelings of hopelessness or depression. And it won't bring back what you've lost. But do you know that God is for you in your suffering, not against you? He's not against you. You have his favor, not his frown. Do you know that? Do you know he's with you in your suffering? Like I mentioned at the beginning of the message, sometimes it's really unhelpful to give grieving people a plan to quote unquote fix their grief. The reason why is because, like some of y'all know, what happens when you've followed the plan, when you've read the verses and you've prayed the prayers and you've gotten 8 hours of sleep and you've eaten well and you've exercised and you've done everything that the doctors told you to do, and the grief is still getting harder and harder to cope with. What happens then? Well, another well-meaning plan can be crushing, can it? It can be crushing. It can seem too simplistic, or it can make you feel like a failure for, quote unquote, not getting better after you followed this plan. What have you done wrong? So I don't want to whip out another plan for you right now at the end of this sermon. I don't want to just throw out another plan for you to follow. I don't think that would be appropriate. Maybe after we've talked and get to hear your story and what you've gone through and what you're going through and what you're feeling, maybe it would be appropriate to think through a careful plan, not to fix you, but to help you walk down this hard path. I think that perhaps could be appropriate. That's for another time. This morning, I just want you to know that if this is what you're feeling this morning, you are not alone. You are not alone if you are feeling hopeless this morning. Many other godly people have felt the grief of hopelessness and wanted to die as well. I mean, think back to Job chapter 1, verse 3. Passage says that Job was the greatest man of the East. He was the greatest man of the East. And this great man felt like this. He was hopeless and wanted to die as well. Or think about Elijah in 1 Kings 19, verse 4. Do you remember that? When Elijah's running away from Jezebel, who's trying to kill him, 1 Kings 19, verse 4 says that Elijah himself went a day's journey into the wilderness and came and sat down under a broom tree. Listen to this. And he asked that he might die, saying, "It is enough. Now, O Lord, take away my life, for I am no better than my fathers." Elijah said that. Like the Elijah that called down fire from heaven. The same guy who didn't have to experience death because God sent him a heavenly Uber to take him up into heaven on a chariot. That guy felt hopeless. That guy wanted to die as well. You're not alone. If you're feeling the weight of hopelessness this morning, you're in good company, actually. The greatest man of the East, the greatest prophet in the Old Testament, felt something what you're feeling as well. While I'm no Job or Elijah, I also want you to know that one of your pastors has walked this path too. For several years in my early 20s, I felt something of what Job was feeling in chapter 3. I didn't see a realistic path out of the grief that I was feeling. I'd walked through the plans and they weren't working. And I wondered, what's the point? What's the point of continuing on if nothing's working? If the grief won't leave? I wanted to go where Elijah and Job wanted to go. If that's you this morning, if you're walking in with some of those thoughts, or you know someone who's there, I just want to let you know right now that I'm sorry. So sorry. if you'll trust me with that experience, let me know what you're walking through. I want to let you know this morning that you at least have one person here who wants to hear what you're going through. I know there are so many others, but know that one of your pastors wants to walk through that with you. Or if you don't have the energy to walk, let's sit. Or if you don't even have the energy to sit, I'll get on the ground with you. But let me know. Let me know if that's where you are. Or you know someone who's in that place. I know there are other brothers and sisters here who would want the same thing. They want to do the same thing with you. You are not You're not alone. You have brothers and sisters here who want to go through this with you. Some who, like myself, have experienced this. You're not alone. And if I can encourage you with one more thing, I want you to know that you're wrong. You're wrong. If you think there's no hope for you or you're struggling with suicidal ideation, let me encourage you this morning that you're just plain wrong. You're wrong. You're very, very wrong. Like Job and like Elijah, you're just not seeing things clearly right now. You're not seeing things clearly. Zach Eswine talks about Elijah in 1 Kings 19. He says this: when Elijah said, "It is enough now, O Lord, take away my life," he was mistaken in his judgment. It wasn't enough. He was wrong. His pain was lying to him regarding his ability to know his future. And his future, in truth, was filled with blessing. Elijah couldn't see a realistic path to blessing over here. But Elijah was wrong. Blessing was coming. Job couldn't see a reasonable way out of his grief. He assumed God was against him. But Job was wrong. His vantage point was wrong. God was for him in his suffering. Today, you may not see a purpose to your life right now. And it feels so right to think that. But you are 100% wrong. You're wrong. No matter what you've done, and no matter what has happened to you, and no matter what your future looks like, God is using today and tomorrow to prepare for you an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. He's using it. He's using the grief today. You know, sometimes I think we separate the pain in this life from the joy of heaven. Like they're two different things going on. And we think that what we have to do is we just have to kind of like tightrope over suffering to make it over to heaven. Like they're two different things, not connected. Like we just have to make it through the semester of suffering so we can get to the break of heaven. Disconnecting the two experiences. But the Bible connects these two experiences. It doesn't separate them. The grief, the depression, they're not inconsequential to the joy you'll experience in heaven. Did you get that? They're not inconsequential. The grief, the depression is not inconsequential to the joy you'll experience in heaven. God's using your grief. He's using your grief to make your joy in heaven more profound. That's what 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 17 is saying. It's talking about preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Paul, the Apostle Paul, is telling us that there will be blooms of happiness in heaven that have their roots in the darkness of grief on earth. Those years of depression, those dark years are making heaven brighter for you. Your feelings of pointlessness have a point. Get that? Your feelings of pointlessness have a point. And that reality drives a stake into today that can settle your heart. It's firm, it's fixed. There is a point to feelings of hopelessness. God is using it. Grief is not pointless, not 1 second of it. It's doing something eternal. You just don't see it right now. Like Job, you're not seeing reality clearly. And that's true for all of us to some degree. Why is that? Well, because God's smile over us this morning is brighter than we think. God's presence with us is closer than we think. And God's plan for our lives is more meaningful than our minds can get around. Our God has a plan for our lives that's more meaningful than we could ever get our minds wrapped around. Don't trust your perception this morning. Trust God's. Trust the God who experienced what Job feared most. Trust Jesus who took the punishment for your sin on the cross and experienced the anger of his Father on your behalf. He actually felt God's anger against him. Trust Jesus who experienced the frown of his Father so you can experience the favor of his Father, who was condemned so that you could be commended, and who did all of this because he thought your eternal life was worth suffering for. When Jesus was asked, are our eternal lives worth all the suffering on the cross? What did he say? Yes. Yes, they are. And he said that so that when our grief feels like too much, and we're asking ourselves, is all this suffering worth living? We can tearfully but confidently say, yes. Yes, life underneath God's favor is worth the suffering. I don't know all the reasons why you're suffering this morning, but I do know you can trust that God. You can trust the God who died for you. Father, you have a bottle next to you, a bottle that keeps the tears of your saints. You have a bottle for each one of us. You know how many times we've cried. And you know when we want to cry, but we're out of tears. You know when we wish we felt emotion, but the depression has brought us to a place where we've stopped feeling. Feel apathetic. You have a bottle for that too. But you're using it. You're using the tears in that bottle to make us drink deeply of the joy of heaven, which we'll experience one day soon. For now, we ask that we have trust to follow you, that we would not trust our own perception of what's the point of our grief, but we would trust the one, your Son, Jesus, who took that grief on himself, took our grief, experienced it, sympathizes with it, and experienced more grief than anyone has ever experienced, all because he loves us. I ask that we would trust him in our grief. Pray all these things in your Son's name.